Imagine riding alone through the desert, the sun burning your skin, the silence almost unbearable.
Have you ever imagined riding alone through the heart of the desert, feeling the scorching sun burning your skin, the dry wind cutting across your face, and an absolute silence that seems to swallow even your own thoughts? The Old West has always been a land of mystery, courage, and solitude, but what would happen if, in this hostile setting, an unexpected sound broke the deadly calm of the landscape? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. Imagine the scene. A lone cowboy, mounted on his horse, follows his path with no clear destination. The arid ground creaks under the animal's hooves, and the horizon seems to offer nothing but dust and heat. This cowboy's name is Ezekiel Carter, a man scarred by the past, someone who has lost much and learned to trust only himself. For him, life is simple: survive one day at a time. But on that suffocating afternoon, fate had prepared something that would change everything. Suddenly, between the distant caw of a crow and the insistent buzzing of insects, a fragile sound cuts through the air, the cry of a baby. Think about it. In the middle of a relentless desert, where even the strongest struggle to endure, a defenseless child, Ezekiel's heart races. Who would leave a baby there at the mercy of the sun, hunger, and the dangers that lurk in every corner of that land? This question echoes not only in his mind but also in yours, doesn't it? Haven't you ever faced that moment when life places something unexpected in your path and forces you to choose between continuing as always or completely changing your course? The cowboy dismounts from his horse, his steps raising small clouds of sand as he approaches. His tired eyes widen when he finds the small bundle, old rags wrapping a fragile but living child. The crying cuts through the silence like a knife. It's impossible to ignore. In that instant, the desert seems to transform. It is no longer just an empty, cruel space, but a stage of decisions that could alter the fate of everyone involved. Ezekiel looks around, searching for some clue, any sign of who could have left that child there. Nothing. Only emptiness and the crushing heat. The dilemma arises immediately: continue his journey and pretend he saw nothing, or risk his own life to save someone he has never met. The Old West is full of stories of bravery, but also of abandonment and tragedy. The difference between heroes and cowards often lies in a single gesture, in an instant of compassion or indifference. As he holds the baby in his arms for the first time, Ezekiel feels something that had long seemed lost: humanity. The crying begins to fade, and the child's calm breathing seems to speak to the loneliness of that man. It is as if fate had placed in his hands a second chance to write his own story. But what kind of price would come with this choice? In the Old West, every misstep could cost a life. Can you imagine the weight of that decision? A cowboy, accustomed to solitude, now with a child to protect in the midst of a land infested with dangers, bandits thirsty for power, wild animals, and a merciless nature. What seemed like just another day of survival in the desert turns into a challenge greater than any duel or hunt he had ever faced. And this is where the journey begins. What Ezekiel will do next, what risks he will face, and how this unexpected encounter may change the course of his life, and perhaps an entire town, is what we will, discover together. So stay with me, because this story is only beginning. And while Ezekiel holds that child in his arms, with the hot wind bringing dust and uncertainty, it is impossible not to think of the times when life also placed us before unexpected choices. Maybe you've gone through a moment when everything seemed stable, but suddenly came a decision capable of changing the course of everything. It is at this point that stories like this touch us so deeply, because in some way, we recognize ourselves in them. And since we are together on this journey, I want to invite you to take part in it even more closely. Leave in the comments what you felt so far. Have you ever lived through a situation where you had to choose between walking alone or extending your hand to someone? Your opinion and experience not only enrich this conversation, but also help create a community of people who connect through these stories. And if this beginning has gripped you, if it has somehow touched your heart or awakened that curiosity that only good narratives awaken, take a moment to leave your like, It may seem like a simple gesture, but believe me, it is this support that keeps alive the purpose of bringing more exciting and inspiring stories like this one. Each like shows that it is worth continuing to produce this kind of content that rescues values of courage, compassion, and humanity. And of course, if you enjoy this style of storytelling and want to keep following stories that move and surprise, subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next chapters of this journey, nor the many other Old West stories yet to come. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content, and together we can take these messages even further. As Ezekiel stares at the horizon with the child in his arms and an uncertain destiny ahead, the feeling is that the desert has ceased to be just a place of silence. Now it holds secrets, dangers, and promises. And what will come next you will discover with me. Ezekiel Carter was one of those men who carried in his eyes the harshness of the desert. It wasn't just the sun that had marked his skin, but an entire life of losses, battles, and silences that no one dared to break. He was known in every town he passed through as the lone cowboy, the one who never stayed long anywhere, who avoided long conversations, and who distanced himself from bonds as if fleeing an ambush. Not that he was bad or insensitive. In fact, those who truly knew him said that behind the coldness, there was a just heart, a sense of honor that could not be corrupted even by the worst circumstances. Years ago, Ezekiel had a family, a sweet woman named Abigail, and a little daughter who lit up his nights with innocent laughter. But the Old West was never a place of guarantees, and a tragedy sealed his fate. An unexpected attack by bandits took from him everything that mattered. Since then, his life became a long, aimless ride, where each stop was only a pause before moving on to nothingness. It was his way of dealing with the pain. No roots, no attachments, no giving fate the chance to once again rip away whatever was precious. This mindset shaped each of his choices, each prolonged silence around the campfire, each refusal to accept company. And yet, there was something in Ezekiel that no one could deny. His word was law. He could be quiet, but never unjust. If he saw someone in trouble, he stepped in. If he noticed a lie, he confronted it. He was the kind of man who inspired respect, not through fear, but through the integrity he conveyed. It was as if the desert itself had shaped in him an invisible armor, forged of discipline and endurance, but one that hid a deeper truth, that behind that barrier existed a profoundly human man. The curious thing is that, even without seeking it, his presence always left an impact on the places he passed through. A simple exchange of words at a saloon counter, a firm look in the face of an injustice, and soon people realized they were before someone who was not just another wandering cowboy. It was as if each gesture carried an untold story, as if there were backstage scenes of pain and courage that no one dared to ask about, yet everyone felt. This reserved and distant demeanor was, for many, a sign of emotional weakness. But the truth is that he had developed his own survival mindset. Expect nothing from anyone to avoid disappointment. Don't get attached to avoid suffering. And paradoxically, it was precisely this choice of living in isolation that made him even more fascinating. Because deep down, people understood that those who shut themselves away like that usually have a reason far greater than it appears. When he held the baby in his arms for the first time, that entire wall began to crack. No matter how many years of solitude he had cultivated, that small life stirred deep memories, bringing back emotions he tried to bury. It was as if fate was testing his endurance, placing before him a new chance to redefine everything. And it is exactly here where the most powerful transformation of any journey lies, when the unexpected forces us to revisit old wounds to find a new purpose. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because understanding Ezekiel is to understand how great decisions are born in the most unlikely moments. What makes a hardened man, accustomed to solitude and distrust, decide to carry in his arms a symbol of fragility and hope? What happens inside the mind of someone who swore never again to get attached, when life confronts him with a choice impossible to ignore? These are the points that reveal not only the story of a cowboy, but the reflection of our own internal battles, those we face in silence when no one is watching. The cutting silence of the desert was broken by a sound that made no sense in that place. A sharp, fragile, insistent cry echoed among the dunes as if it were a desperate plea for help. Ezekiel Carter stopped his horse suddenly, sweat running down his forehead and his eyes squinting to locate the source of that unlikely sound. His heart, accustomed to beating firmly in the face of duels and ambushes, faltered. It was impossible to mistake. It was the cry of a baby. He dismounted slowly, the spurs jingling on the sandy ground, and each step lifted small clouds of dust. His hard gaze, which normally hid any trace of emotion, now carried something different, a mix of disbelief and tension. Ezekiel was not a man easily surprised, but there was something that defied all logic. Kneeling, he moved aside a torn piece of fabric and found the small bundle. A baby, wrapped in worn-out rags, cried with all its strength as if screaming against fate. "Who would leave a defenseless child here?" he murmured, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. The question found no answer in the silence, only in the persistent eyes, sound of the wind and the relentless sun that threatened to consume everything around. The desert was no place for innocence. There, every living being had to fight tooth and nail to survive. And yet, before him was a life so fragile it had no chance on its own. Ezekiel's expression tightened. He knew what it meant to take that child into his arms. It wasn't just holding a small, vulnerable body. It was assuming a weight, a responsibility, a detour from his path of isolation. That moment became an invisible crossroads, where each decision would impact not only the present but his entire journey. The mindset he had cultivated for years, to never again get attached, to never again allow life to wound him, was now cruelly and unexpectedly tested. The desert seemed to conspire against him. Each gust of wind, each ray of sun burning his skin, reinforced the sense of urgency. The child would not last long. Ezekiel knew this. His instinct told him he needed to act quickly, but his mind reminded him of the pain that would come with it. He had lost everything once, and to carry again the burden of affection could mean opening wounds that had never healed. It was as if fate had thrown upon his shoulders a bitter revelation. You cannot run forever from what truly matters. This unexpected encounter carried with it a clash of hidden truths. The first was clear. No matter how much he tried to hide behind a facade of coldness, Ezekiel was still capable of feeling compassion. The second was even more disturbing. Perhaps that child wasn't there by chance. The Old West was full of stories of buried secrets, broken alliances, and conspiracies that shaped lives. Nothing simply happened. There was always a hidden reason behind the scenes. As the baby cried in his arms, the cowboy realized this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of an inevitable transformation. The solitude that for years had been his armor now seemed to dissolve before the warmth of an innocent life. And no matter how much he tried to convince himself that he could walk away, he already knew deep inside that he couldn't. The impact of that decision was beyond logic. It was as if the universe were offering him a second chance, a new path amid the scorching sands. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject because to understand the magnitude of this choice is to understand how life, in its most unlikely moments, forces us to face what we've avoided for so long. What drives someone to transform before such a sudden event? What invisible force makes us abandon a safe route to enter a journey full of uncertainties? These questions are not just about Ezekiel, but about each of us, about the revelations that arise when reality confronts us without warning. And I want to know how this resonates with you. Write in the comments a simple but truthful phrase. I'm on this journey too. I want to see who here has already felt the weight of an unexpected decision completely change the course of their own story. Ezekiel's heart pounded heavily in his chest as he stared at that small, fragile being, wrapped in rags that barely protected against the desert heat. The dry wind carried dust into his eyes, but he knew it wasn't just that which made them burn. The true weight was inside him, in the dilemma that surged like an old wound being reopened. To continue his journey and pretend he had seen nothing was the easiest path. All he had to do was mount his horse, turn his back, and let the desert carry out its natural sentence. It was what any cold man would do to avoid carrying a burden that could cost his own life. But Ezekiel had never been just any man. As the baby cried in his arms, his mind was invaded by memories he had tried to bury for years. The delicate face of his lost daughter appeared in nearly unbearable flashes, the sound of childish laughter, the warmth of small arms around his neck, and then the eternal silence that came with tragedy. The pain had transformed him into someone who believed he no longer deserved ties, as if protecting himself were the only way to survive in a cruel world. Now, faced with this unexpected encounter, the entire wall he had built around his heart began to crack irreversibly. The inner conflict was crushing. On one side, the survival mindset that had kept him alive until then. Don't get attached. Don't risk more than necessary. Don't give fate another chance to tear away what little dignity remained. On the other, an instinctive compassion that stubbornly insisted on surfacing, reminding him there was still humanity within him. There were no guns, no duels, no adversaries in sight. The real enemy now was internal, invisible, but powerful. The decision between carrying a weight that could destroy him or ignoring it, and living with the guilt of having abandoned an innocent life. In the Old West, courage was measured by bullets fired, by coldness in the face of threats, and by the ability to withstand hunger and danger. But in that instant, Ezekiel realized a hidden truth. True courage was in allowing oneself to feel, in allowing oneself to be vulnerable. Perhaps it was easier to face an entire gang than to hold a defenseless baby in his arms, because the baby did not demand only physical strength. It demanded surrender, trust, a radical transformation of who he had become. The memory of his lost daughter returned with an almost unbearable force, and the impact was devastating. He wondered if fate was mocking him, offering a chance for redemption, or preparing an emotional trap that would destroy him from within. How many times does life place before us tests that seem cruel, but deep down are invitations to rewrite our own story? The desert seemed to watch in silence, as if the very earth were waiting to see what decision would be made. Ezekiel took a deep breath. The heat was suffocating, but nothing was more uncomfortable than the battle being waged inside him. It was a fight between fear and hope, between self-preservation and compassion, between remaining a solitary man or allowing a new journey to begin. He knew he could not ignore what he felt. The baby had awakened something dormant, the capacity to care, to protect, to fight for something greater than himself. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is in this kind of decision that the essence of any journey is revealed. When life forces us to choose between moving forward as always or risking everything in the name of something we do not yet understand, that is when our true nature appears. It is not just about Ezekiel. It is about all of us, about the impact of choices that seem small but carry immense revelations. The decision of one man in that desert could change not only his destiny, but that of everyone who crossed his path from then on. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning each step in the desert into an almost unbearable challenge. The baby, nestled against Ezekiel's chest, cried from hunger, and that sound cut deeper than any bullet wound he had ever endured. Thirst was also a constant enemy, burning the cowboy's throat as he tried to ration the little water left in his canteen. With every sip saved, he knew he was choosing between prolonging his own resistance or granting a few more minutes of life to that defenseless child. That was the harshness of the Old West. There was no room for illusions, only for quick and often cruel decisions. As he moved forward, his sharp eyes scanned the vastness in search of some sign of shelter. The desert, however, offered nothing but sand, rocks, and the distant sound of vultures already circling like an omen. Ezekiel felt the weight of destiny on his shoulders, and his mind calculated every possibility. The baby's hunger could not wait. Then, in the distance, a ruined structure appeared on the horizon. An abandoned ranch with loose boards creaking in the wind seemed to be the only chance of finding something to ease that torment. With firm steps but hastened by urgency, he approached. The place was in shambles, bullet marks on the walls and broken furniture scattered across the floor. Still, amid the abandonment, Ezekiel found the unexpected. a thin goat roaming free that seemed to have survived the chaos that had destroyed that home. It was a breath of hope. With calloused hands, he improvised a container and managed to draw a little milk, enough to soothe the baby's relentless cries. That small gesture brought a relief that could not be measured in words. Ezekiel's gaze softened for an instant, as if he had received a silent answer that he was on the right path, despite all the hardships. But the desert never forgives completely. While resting in the rare shade of a large cactus, trying to regain strength and offer the baby some comfort, Ezekiel noticed signs of movement on the horizon, dust rising from horses. It wasn't hard to guess what that meant. Bandits. The region was known for being territory of raiders who preyed on unsuspecting travelers. Ezekiel knew he couldn't afford to be discovered in that situation. Carrying a baby in his arms made him vulnerable, slow, and every detail worked against his survival. The survival instinct spoke louder once again. He quickly erased the tracks left around the ranch and sought a more discreet position among the shadows of the land. His heart pounded hard, but not from fear for himself, rather from the responsibility he now carried. Every distant noise was analyzed, every sound of the wind mistaken for the approach of enemies. He felt like a man divided between two worlds, the cold, calculating survivor, and the protector who was awakening a compassion he thought long lost. And in this brutal contrast, the journey became even more intense. The impact of hunger and thirst had already tested his limits, and now human threat appeared to remind him that in the Old West, there was no respite, only a succession of trials imposed on those who dared to challenge fate. What for many would be the end, for Ezekiel represented a new beginning, although he wasn't fully aware of it yet. The baby in his arms was at once the greatest obstacle and the deepest revelation of his own transformation. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because these first obstacles are not only part of a survival narrative, but symbols of the battles we all face when confronted with something that demands more of us than we ever imagined. It is in hunger, thirst, and the presence of invisible or declared enemies that we discover the essence of our own mindset. It is in these backstage moments, where almost no one sees, that the decisions that change everything are forged. The dust on the horizon left no more doubts. It wasn't just the wind moving the sand. They were horses. Horses ridden by men he knew by reputation. Hank Iron Eye's gang advanced like a storm of violence, and anyone unlucky enough to cross their path knew they rarely left alive. Ezekiel felt his whole body harden, not from fear, but from alertness. The baby in his arms breathed peacefully, oblivious to the danger approaching. For those men, human life had no value at all, but they couldn't imagine what he was carrying. Still, the simple sight of something in Ezekiel's arms would spark a fatal curiosity. Hank Iron Eye was known not only for brutality, but also for cruel intelligence. He knew how to measure every move, to observe every detail. Ezekiel had heard enough stories to understand he wasn't facing common enemies. That gang didn't forgive mistakes, and being in their territory was practically a sentence. The problem was that fate had chosen this exact moment to test his courage once again. Now it wasn't just hunger, thirst, or the desert. It was the direct threat of men who lived off chaos, plunder, and fear. Ezekiel knew his solitary figure always drew attention, but now there was something different. He carried a bundle against his chest. The bandits' sharp eyes would soon notice, and in their minds there would be no doubt. If the cowboy was protecting it so carefully, it had to be something valuable. Gold, money, perhaps some secret map. In the Old West, people always believed that whatever a man protected could enrich or save their own lives. The detail that inside there was only a baby didn't matter. For men like Hank, the mere idea of hidden treasure was enough to justify any cruelty. The impact of the situation was devastating. Ezekiel couldn't simply run, because the child would not withstand a fast escape in such hostile terrain. He also couldn't easily hide, because the desert offered few shadows, and the abandoned ranch had already become a risk. What remained was to trust his own cunning, improvise every second, and keep a cool head. It was like returning to a duel, but this time the trigger wasn't only in the holster. The real duel was internal, a battle between the need to protect and the certainty of being at a disadvantage. The tension grew with every step the horses took closer. The sound of hooves echoed in Ezekiel's chest like drums announcing an inevitable war. He pressed the baby against him, not as a burden, but as a silent promise that he would not allow that small being to be touched by the evil surrounding them. The Old West was full of stories of men broken by the weight of violence, but Ezekiel didn't want to be just another name erased by the dust. He knew this encounter could become a revelation about who he truly was and how far he was willing to go for something greater than his own survival. It was curious to realize how men's mindsets shaped their choices. For Hank, value was in possession, in domination, in theft. For Ezekiel, in that moment, value was in protection, in compassion, in something no one expected to see in a lone cowboy. This difference in vision was the thin line separating a man of honor from a bandit, and it was precisely that line that was about to be tested before the entire desert. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this is not only about a chase or a confrontation. It is about the impact our decisions have when we are faced with what we fear most. External danger will always exist, but it is the way we face that danger that reveals the hidden truth about ourselves. Ezekiel was about to live one of the most intense moments of his journey, and every detail of that choice would show whether he was still just a survivor or was already becoming something much greater. The trap was closing too fast. Hank Iron Eye's gang riders were already close enough for Ezekiel to hear their laughter dripping with cruelty. He knew that kind of sound, the confidence of predators who believed they had their prey exactly where they wanted. The desert, wide and open, seemed to conspire against him, exposing every move, leaving him without escape routes. With the baby pressed against his chest, he realized he could not fight the same way he had so many times before. The child was his weakness, and at the same time the reason why he could not surrender. It was a suffocating dilemma, where any mistake would have irreversible consequences. It was in that instant, when everything seemed inevitable, that something unexpected happened. From the high rocks a different sound echoed, followed by the swift whistle of an arrow cutting through the air. The projectile struck close to one of the bandits' feet, startling the horse and creating brief confusion. Ezekiel raised his eyes and saw a firm figure, skin golden from the sun and dark hair flowing in the wind. It was a young native woman, known by some as Serene Cloud. The skill with which she wielded the bow and the confidence in her stance revealed she was no mere onlooker. She knew the land like no one else and moved as if she were part of the earth itself. The gang, unsettled by the interruption, pulled back for a few moments, trying to understand where those precise shots were coming from. Ezekiel, seizing the opening, pulled the baby closer and ran toward a rock formation that offered some protection. Serene Cloud descended swiftly, positioning herself between him and the enemies, as if she had known him for years, even without ever exchanging a word. It was an unlikely alliance, the joining of two worlds that rarely met without distrust. A lone cowboy, scarred by pain, and a brave native woman, guided by the protective instinct of her people. Ezekiel's eyes met hers, and in silence both understood there was no room for hesitation. Trust was born there, in the urgency of survival. She knew the backroads of that territory, every secret trail, every hidden vantage point in a desert that to others was only sand and heat. Ezekiel's mind, trained to distrust everything and everyone, felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the sense of not being completely alone. While Serene Cloud's arrows kept the gang at a distance, Ezekiel realized that this alliance could be more than circumstantial. There was a hidden truth in her presence, something that went beyond coincidence. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps it was simply life showing him that no matter how much he insisted on isolation, there would always be moments when help came in the most unexpected forms. The transformation beginning within him didn't come only from the baby in his arms, but also from the courage to recognize he needed support. This improvised union revealed a profound impact. Sometimes the most unlikely paths become the most necessary. Ezekiel, who had so often refused company, now found himself protected by someone who owed him nothing, yet risked her life to save his and the child's. And that made him reflect on how the decisions we make echo beyond ourselves, attracting people, creating connections that could never have been planned. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this encounter is not just about two characters crossing paths in the midst of danger. It is about the inner journey we all face when we realize that strength does not lie only in fighting alone, but in accepting alliances that transform our worldview. It is about understanding that behind the scenes of life, there are always revelations ready to remind us that courage and trust can walk side by side. The dust had settled after the clash, but tension still hung in the air. Ezekiel, breathless, tried to catch his breath while holding the baby against his chest. Serene Cloud, watchful, kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, making sure Hank Iron Eye's men had truly retreated. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of expectation. Something was about to be revealed, and both knew that child could not be merely the result of chance. In the Old West, nothing happened without a hidden reason, and fate was rarely generous enough to place an innocent life in the hands of a stranger without a deeper purpose. As he adjusted the rags around the small body, Ezekiel noticed something that had gone unnoticed before. A necklace, simple at first glance, but with a medallion engraved with symbols he vaguely recognized. The object was tied around the baby's neck, hidden by the worn fabric. When his calloused fingers touched the cold metal, a strange sensation ran through him. He had seen that symbol before, in maps and in the stories that circulated among travelers. It was the mark of an old family, known for owning fertile lands in a region coveted and disputed for years. Serene Cloud, realizing what Ezekiel was holding, widened her eyes. In a low, almost reverent voice, she explained that the necklace was not just a family keepsake. It was proof of lineage, a sign of inheritance. The baby had not been abandoned by chance. He was the last survivor of a family wiped out by none other than Hank's gang, who sought to seize the lands and power that came with them. That revelation struck like lightning across the hot sands. That small, fragile being carried the weight of a bloody history and the potential to change the fate of an entire region. Ezekiel's mind spun in spirals of memories and reasoning. Until then, protecting the baby had been a matter of humanity, compassion, perhaps even personal redemption. But now there was a hidden truth that made everything even more dangerous. He was not just saving a life, he was directly challenging Hank's dominion and his gang. The impact of that discovery was overwhelming. Carrying that child meant also carrying the spark of conflict, a symbol that could unite those who still resisted Iron Eye's tyranny. Serene Cloud understood better than anyone the gravity of what they held in their hands. Behind the scenes of land disputes, symbols of legitimacy like that necklace were worth more than weapons. They could attract allies but also multiply enemies. Ezekiel realized there was no turning back. From the moment he discovered the baby's identity, his solitary journey had turned into a greater mission, one that involved not only his life but the balance of power across the entire region. Ezekiel's gaze hardened, not with coldness, but with determination. The memory of his lost daughter still burned in his mind, and now fate placed before him the chance to protect another child, not just out of compassion, but for a purpose that could transcend his own pain. It was as if the universe had placed him at a crossroads. Flee and try to preserve himself, or stay and accept the responsibility of carrying in his arms not only a baby but the future of an entire people. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what we see here is not just a shocking revelation within an Old West story. It is a reflection of how, many times, life presents us with symbols that completely change our mindset. Small details, seemingly insignificant, can carry hidden truths with the power to transform entire journeys. And it is in these moments that we realize our decisions are not only about the present, but also about the generations and paths that will come after us. Ezekiel sat in silence for long minutes, under the crooked shade of a dry tree, with the baby asleep in his arms, and the necklace swaying gently over the small chest. The sun was already setting on the horizon, painting the sky in red and orange, as if the desert itself knew something important was about to happen. His mind raced. All his life, solitude had been his only faithful companion. Since the loss of his wife and daughter, He had sworn never again to allow anyone into his heart. That mindset had kept him alive, but it had also condemned him to an existence without purpose, a hollow journey repeated day after day. Now, however, fate forced him to face the hardest decision of his life. He could simply leave it all behind, mount his horse, move on, and forget he had ever held that baby. It would be the most logical, the safest choice. After all, who was he to fight against Hank Iron Eye and his entire gang? What chance did he have against such a powerful, entrenched force? On the other hand, ignoring that defenseless life would be a weight impossible to carry. The revelation about the necklace, about the child's inheritance, made the decision even heavier. It was not just compassion, it was justice. The Old West was marked by stories of abuse, of powerful men crushing the innocent, and perhaps now he had the chance to oppose that in a way he had never dared before. The conflict inside him seemed to split his soul in two. The old Ezekiel, cold and solitary, said it was madness to get involved. But a deeper voice, born of the memories of his lost daughter, insisted he could not abandon that child to the same fate. It was as if life had given him a second chance to be a father, to protect what had once been torn from him. That hidden truth burned in his chest stronger than any fear. With every heartbeat, he felt that to run would be to betray not only the baby, but himself. The transformation began subtly, but undeniably. Looking at the baby, Ezekiel no longer saw only a burden. He saw a purpose. He saw the possibility of breaking the cycle of pain that had imprisoned him for years. This was not just about revenge or survival. It was about redemption. The lone cowboy who had always fled from bonds now understood he was before a bond that could not be ignored. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something like hope. Serene Cloud observed him in silence, respecting the battle he fought within himself. She knew she could not decide for him, but she also understood that his courage would be the key to facing what was to come. Ezekiel lifted his eyes, and when they met hers, he saw not only confidence but the promise that he would not have to carry this weight alone. It was a silent but powerful alliance, the reminder that even the loneliest find strength when they accept to share the path. The final decision formed in his mind like an inevitable sentence. There was no more room for doubt. He would not abandon the baby. He would not allow evil to triumph without resistance. For the first time since the tragedy that had changed him, Ezekiel decided he would not be just a survivor. He would be a protector, a fighter against injustice. The weight of that choice was enormous, but the meaning it carried was even greater. He held the baby tightly, feeling the warmth of that life against his chest, and whispered to himself like a promise. This time, he would not ride alone. The desert around seemed to hear and keep the vow, as if the very earth recognized the importance of the moment. It was the beginning of a new journey, marked by courage and compassion, where each step would be guided not by the pain of the past, but by the determination to build a different future. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because Ezekiel's decision is not just a turning point in his story, but a mirror for all of us. How many times do we face choices where taking the easy path means betraying who we truly are? The impact of deciding to protect, of deciding to fight, even when everything seems lost, is what shapes the essence of any journey. And this truth goes beyond the Old West. It speaks directly to who we choose to be when life puts us to the test. The cold night wind began to blow, carrying with it the deep silence that follows great moments of decision. Ezekiel stood firm, the fool, baby against his chest, and Serene Cloud at his side like a silent sentinel. That moment was not just the end of a dilemma, but the beginning of something greater, a transformation that became palpable in every detail. The lone cowboy, known for his reserve and the hardness forged in years of pain, now carried in his hands the most human and heaviest responsibility he had ever faced, to protect a life that was not his, but that symbolized an entire future. The scene had something both poetic and brutal. The desert, which had always been for him just a backdrop for survival, now became the witness of a revelation. It wasn't about guns, it wasn't about duels or bravado. It was about courage in its purest form, the kind that does not demand shots fired, but surrender. In the Old West, where every man was measured by how quickly he could draw his gun, Ezekiel discovered that the true weight of a brave heart was in extending a hand, in welcoming, in not turning his back when life placed before him a choice no one else dared to face. That realization changed everything. He was no longer running from the past, but facing it head on. The memory of his lost daughter ceased to be only a painful scar and became a reminder that there was still room for compassion, for rebuilding. The decision not to ride alone was no longer only about the baby. It was about himself. It was about allowing himself to be human again, about breaking the invisible prison that pain had built around his soul. Serene Cloud watched him with attentive eyes, and in that gaze was something that went beyond a momentary partnership. There was the recognition of a hidden truth, that this man, marked by solitude, had just chosen a path that would not only change his life, but could also alter the background of history in that region. Because protecting that child was not only an act of compassion, it was also an act of resistance against tyranny, against fear, against the darkness Hank and his gang spread. Ezekiel's journey was becoming greater than he had imagined. Every step from then on carried weight. Every decision had consequences that went beyond his own survival. And deep down, that is what had always separated true heroes from those who only sought to live another day. The ability to take on a purpose that transcends self-interest. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this climax scene is not just about a cowboy and a baby in the desert. It is about what courage means in any time, in any place. The courage to rise when it would be easier to retreat. The courage to protect when it would be simpler to ignore. The courage to open the heart when instinct begs to close it. It is at this crossroads that we discover who we really are. And it is in this revelation that life gains meaning. And if you have made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. And that makes me happy, because that was always the intention, to show that even in the middle of the most hostile desert, there are moments of transformation capable of changing destinies. And since we have shared this journey together, how about leaving your like? This simple gesture shows that it's worth continuing to bring stories that inspire courage, compassion, and choices that go beyond the ordinary. And I want to ask you a question. If you were in Ezekiel's place, would you have had the courage to carry in your arms a life that could put your own at risk? Write in the comments. I would protect if that answer makes sense to you. It will be amazing to know who walked with me until the end of this narrative. And of course, if you feel that this kind of content adds something valuable, subscribe to the channel. It's your way of being closer, of continuing to receive stories that not only entertain but also make us reflect on our own choices. Your presence here is what gives meaning to all this. And since you are here, don't stop now. There's another story right here that will move you. Click and continue with me there.